The battering ram hits the door. Splinters fly. My partner just stole $300 million using my own fingerprints, and now the FBI is storming my mansion. I've got 3 seconds to wipe the servers before they grab me. My ribs crack under a tactical boot, but I palm the bypass key as they drag me away. The screen flickers. One last chance to erase the evidence. Too late. The call connects. Michael's laughing from a private jet, my life unraveling in his hands. The cuffs bite into my wrists. Game over? Not yet. Sarah Johnson isn't just my lawyer, she's the one who tipped them off. But now she's staring at me like she just realized we've both been played. The progress bar crawled toward 98%. A thin blue line mocking the thunderous splintering of wood downstairs. David Miller's fingers spasmed over the mechanical keyboard, clicking through subdirectories with a frantic, rhythmic precision. Sweat pooled in the small of his spine, soaking his silk shirt until it clung like a second skin. The air in the study tasted of ozone and stale coffee. He could hear the heavy thud of the battering ram against the oak front door of his Greenwich mansion, a sound like a giant's heartbeat, slow and inevitable. David's index finger twitched, tapping the desk in a rapid, prime number sequence. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. It was the rhythm of his brother's old secret knock, a ghost of a sensation that kept his mind from fracturing. Another crash shook the floorboards. Heavy boots thudded against the stairs, a rhythmic, predatory drumming. David ignored the stinging salt in his eyes. He hammered the delete key once, twice, praying for the magnetic platters to spin faster. The hard drive groaned, a high-pitched whine echoing the mechanical stress of the purge. He wasn't just deleting files. He was trying to erase the digital footprints Michael had left behind, like poisoned breadcrumbs. The door exploded inward. Plaster dust choked the room, coating the mahogany desk in a fine white shroud. David didn't turn. He lunged for the power cable, his hand brushing the warm plastic casing. A weight like a falling building slammed into his shoulders. The air rushed from his lungs in a ragged wheeze as his face hit the desk. Polished wood scraped his cheek. Agent Marcus Reed pressed a forearm into David's neck, the smell of gun oil and winter air radiating from his tactical vest. "Stop!" Reed's voice grated like gravel over stone. David clawed at the desk's edge, watching the monitor. The blue bar flickered. 99%. "Move and I'll break your collarbone." Reed spat. The agent's gloved hand clamped over David's wrist, wrenching it away from the computer. On the screen, the cursor blinked once, twice, and then the display went black. David slumped against the mahogany, his breath hitching as the silence of the room grew heavy with the scent of ozone and defeat. He felt the cold bite of steel as the handcuffs ratcheted tight around his wrists, the metal teeth clicking with a finality that made his stomach churn. "You're late, Marcus," David wheezed, his cheek still pressed against the desk. "The data's gone." Reed didn't answer. He hauled David upright, his grip like a vice. The room was suddenly full of shadows and the frantic beams of flashlights. Just as Reed began to lead him toward the door, a sharp, melodic chime cut through the tension. It was the sound of a high-end video call. David's eyes darted to the secondary monitor on the wall, one he hadn't managed to disconnect. The screen flickered to life, revealing the interior of a private jet. Michael Davis sat in a cream-colored leather seat, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked impeccable, his silk tie perfectly knotted, his smile bright and hollow. Behind him, the clouds moved past the window at 500 miles per hour. "Hello, David," Michael said, his voice smooth as velvet over the speakers. "I see the welcoming committee arrived. Agent Reed, I hope you're taking good care of my former partner." He's a bit fragile when things don't go according to his calculations. David's jaw tightened. You won't get away with this, Michael. I wiped the bridge. The transfers are flagged. Michael laughed, a rich, theatrical sound. Oh, David, always thinking in terms of code. You forgot the human element, or rather, the biological one. Michael leaned into the camera, his cold eyes gleaming. I didn't just use your passwords. I used the high-resolution scan of your retinas from our last board meeting. I used the voice samples from our weekly briefings. Every dollar that moved into those offshore accounts carries your unique biological signature. To the world, you didn't just authorize these thefts. You whispered them into existence. The weight of the betrayal hit David harder than the agent's tackle. He felt the world tilt. Michael hadn't just stolen the money. He had stolen David's identity, turning his own body into the weapon used to destroy him. Why? David whispered. ROI, David, Michael replied, swirling his drink. You were a brilliant asset, but your value peaked 3 months ago. Now, you're just a tax write-off. Enjoy the federal hospitality. The screen went black. The silence that followed was suffocating. Reed's grip on David's arm tightened, but for a second, the agent's eyes betrayed a flicker of something. Not pity, but a hunter's suspicion. Move, Reed commanded, though the edge in his voice had shifted. As they moved toward the hallway, David felt the edge of the mahogany desk against his hip. He knew this room better than he knew his own face. Under the lip of the desk, held by a small magnetic strip, was a thin silver rectangle, a hardware bypass key he designed for emergencies. It was a physical bridge that could force a connection to any encrypted drive, bypassing software locks entirely. While Reed turned his head to bark an order at a subordinate, David leaned back slightly. He used his cuffed hands, fingers dancing in that familiar 2-3-5 rhythm, to find the cold metal. With a practiced flick of the wrist, he palmed the device, sliding it into the deep recess of his sleeve. The metal bit into his skin, a sharp, reassuring sting. The walk down the grand staircase felt like a funeral procession. The air in the foyer was thick with the smell of wet pavement and the ozone of the agent's radios. Outside, the blue and red lights of the police cruisers strobed against the white stone of the mansion, turning the sanctuary into a crime scene. David was shoved into the back of a black SUV, the leather cold and smelling of industrial cleaner. Hours later, the world was reduced to a windowless interrogation room in the city. The walls were a sickly shade of gray, illuminated by a buzzing fluorescent light that vibrated in David's teeth. He sat with his hands bolted to a metal table, his index finger tapping out prime numbers against the steel. Tap, 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 tap. The door opened, and a woman walked in. She wasn't an agent. She wore a charcoal suit that looked 2 sizes too large, her hair a chaotic nest of brown curls. She carried a stack of case files so thick they seemed to groan under their own weight. "I'm Sarah Johnson," she said, her voice tired and raspy. She dropped the files on the table with a thud that echoed like a gunshot. "I'm your public defender. And before you start, I'm sorry. I'm sorry the coffee in the lobby is terrible, and I'm sorry you're in this mess." David looked at her, his eyes scanning her for data. "You're apologizing for the coffee? I'm facing 20 years for a crime I didn't commit, and you're worried about the beans?" Sarah sat down, opening a physical spreadsheet she kept in her purse. She scribbled something in a column. "Sorry for the poor timing of my apology," she muttered. She looked up, her expression hardening. "Look, Mr. Miller, let's be honest. I'm the reason you're here." David stopped tapping. What? Subverted. I was the whistleblower, Sarah said, leaning forward. Her eyes were sharp, devoid of the fixer persona she usually wore. 6 months ago, I received an anonymous tip about the irregularities in your company's ledger. I spent 3 months tracking the flow of money. I'm the one who handed the initial evidence to the FBI. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was stopping a predator. David felt a surge of hope. If she was the one who started the investigation, she knew the data. She was smart enough to see the flaws. Then you've seen the logs. You know the transfers don't match my login patterns. If you look at the latency in the biometric pings, you'll see they were routed through a secondary server. You have the power to fix this. You can tell Reed that the evidence you provided was incomplete. David leaned in, his voice urgent. Sarah, listen to me. I have a bypass key. If you can get me a laptop, even for 5 minutes, I can show you the ghost signature Michael left behind. You're a defender of justice, right? You found the truth once, you can find it again. This is the logical move. We work together. We expose the fraud, and the system corrects itself. Sarah looked at him, and for a moment, a small, weary smile touched her lips. You're right. The math doesn't lie. I've been looking at the files Reed's team recovered from your house. There are inconsistencies, things that didn't make sense when I first flagged them. She reached out and touched his hand, a rare moment of human connection. I'll talk to the district attorney. I'll tell them we need a forensic audit of the whistleblower files. We're going to get you out of here, David. David felt a massive weight lift from his chest. His breathing slowed, the frantic rhythm of his heart finally settling. Phase 2. False positive. He had an ally. Someone who knew the architecture of the case better than anyone. He could almost see the path to freedom, a simple matter of reevaluating the data. Sarah stood up, gathering her files. I'll be back in 2 hours. Just stay quiet. She turned to the door, but as she moved, David noticed something. Phase 3. The crack. She didn't walk toward the exit. She stopped by the one-way mirror, her reflection ghosting over the glass. She didn't look at the door. She looked at the ceiling, her lips moving silently. She wasn't counting tiles like Judge Wilson would, but she was waiting for a signal. The door didn't open for Sarah to leave. Instead, Agent Reed walked in, followed by a man David recognized instantly. Robert Wilson, the presiding judge for the district. Thank you, Sarah, Wilson said, his voice like velvet over gravel. Your cooperation in confirming the defendant's confession of possessing illegal hardware is noted. David's blood turned to ice. Phase 4. Catastrophic reveal. Sarah didn't look at David. She was staring at her apology log, her fingers trembling as she wrote. I'm so sorry, David, she whispered, her voice cracking. They told me if I didn't help them secure the hardware key, they'd disbar me for the errors I made in the initial filing. They said you were going down anyway. They just needed the physical evidence to close the loop. Reed stepped forward, his hand outstretched. The key, Miller. Give it up. David realized the trap with a sickening clarity. Sarah hadn't been sent to help him. She had been sent to bait him into admitting he had the bypass key. By telling her about it, he had just handed them the one piece of evidence that proved he had the tools to commit the very crimes he was accused of. The inconsistencies she mentioned weren't a way out. They were the justification for a more aggressive search. You don't understand, David gasped, backing his chair against the wall. That key is the only thing that can prove my innocence. No, Judge Wilson said, looking up at the ceiling tiles, his lips moving in a silent count. That key is a federal offense. Possession of a Tier 1 decryption device without a license. It doesn't matter what's on your servers anymore, Mr. Miller. You just handed us the smoking gun. Reed grabbed David's arm, his thumb pressing into a nerve, until David's hand involuntarily spasmed open. The silver bypass key clattered onto the metal table. Reed snatched it up, sealing it in a plastic evidence bag. The DOJ just moved your trial up, Reed said, his voice cold. You have 10 days before you're moved to a permanent facility. And Sarah, she's not your lawyer anymore. She's the star witness for the prosecution. Sarah fled the room, her sobbing echoing in the hallway. David was left alone with Reed and the judge. The silence was no longer heavy. It was a vacuum, sucking the very air from his lungs. He had tried to play the system, and the system had simply rewritten the rules to ensure he lost. The following week was a blur of gray walls and the smell of floor wax. David was placed under house arrest at his mansion, not out of mercy, but because the federal holding cells were over capacity after a massive sweep. He was fitted with an ankle monitor that felt like a lead shackle, a heavy black box that vibrated every time he moved too close to the perimeter. The house, once his sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. The grand piano in the foyer sat like a polished coffin, its lid glued shut. David spent his hours in the kitchen, the only room where the agents allowed him some measure of privacy. He sat at the island, his fingers tapping the granite. 2, 3, 5, 7. He wasn't idle. Even without his main servers, David's mind was a processor that couldn't be shut down. He had managed to salvage a tablet, an old cracked device hidden in a cereal box that the agents had overlooked. He used the neighbor's unencrypted Wi-Fi, the signal weak and flickering like a dying candle. It was on the third night that he found it. Deep within the company's ghost code, buried under layers of subroutines he had written years ago, was a new sequence. It wasn't his. It was a dead man's switch, a digital ticking bomb designed to trigger a final, massive transfer of funds. David's breath hitched. The destination wasn't a private bank in the Caymans. It was a shell company linked to a known extremist group in Eastern Europe. 48 hours, David whispered, the blue light of the tablet reflecting in his glasses. He's not just stealing the money. He's turning me into a terrorist. If the switch triggered, David wouldn't just go to prison for fraud. He would disappear into a black site, a ghost in the system with no rights and no future. He tried to inject a counter code, his fingers flying over the cracked screen. But every time he gained a foothold, the connection died. Access denied. A cold shiver ran down his spine. He wasn't just being throttled by the ISP. Someone was in the house's local network. Someone was watching him in real time. He stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs. The kitchen was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the high windows. He heard a faint sound, a window sliding upward in the guest bedroom upstairs. Then, the rhythmic clack of a latch being released. He wasn't alone. David moved toward the pantry, his movement slow and deliberate. He felt the weight of the ankle monitor, a constant reminder of his tether. He reached for the heavy cast-iron skillet hanging from the rack, the cold metal biting into his palm. The air smelled of rain and something sharp, the scent of a stranger's cologne. A shadow detached itself from the doorway. The fixer was a man of medium height, dressed in nondescript black tactical gear. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The glint of a suppressed pistol in his hand said everything. David didn't think. He lunged. The skillet swung in a wide arc, clanging against the intruder's forearm. The gun fired, a soft thwip, and a marble tile near David's foot shattered into white dust. David scrambled back, his boots slipping on the polished floor. He reached for the kitchen's main control panel, a small touch screen mounted near the stove. The fixer recovered quickly, his movements fluid and professional. He leveled the gun at David's chest. "Michael sends his regards," the man whispered. David's fingers slammed into the emergency icon on the screen. He didn't call the police. He triggered the industrial fire suppression system. A deafening roar filled the kitchen as the ceiling vents exploded. A thick, white cloud of chemical foam erupted, a blinding blizzard that filled the room in seconds. The air became a wall of white, tasting of baking soda and bitter chemicals. David heard the fixer coughing, the sound of the gun firing wildly into the foam. David dropped to his knees, where the air was slightly clearer. He crawled toward the back stairs, his hands sinking into the cold, wet sludge of the foam. He could hear the intruder thrashing, the heavy clatter of a man blinded and disoriented. David burst through the door to the basement, his lungs burning. He didn't stop until he reached the heavy steel door of the wine cellar. He slammed it shut and threw the bolt, leaning against the cold stone wall as the sound of the fire alarm wailed through the house, a high-pitched shriek that vibrated in his very marrow. He stayed there for hours, huddled among the vintage Bordeaux, until the red and blue lights once again painted the walls of his home. The next morning, Agent Reed was back. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. He sat across from David in the foam-streaked kitchen, a cup of coffee in his hand. The fixer was gone, having slipped out through the same window he entered before the backup arrived. "You should have told me someone was coming for you," Reed said, his voice weary. "Would you have believed me?" David countered, his voice raspy from the chemicals. "Or would you have said I was simulating an attack to justify a breach of my house arrest?" Reed sighed, rubbing his eyes. "Miller, things just got worse. We analyzed the tablet you were using. We found the switch." David leaned forward. "Then you know Michael is setting me up for a terrorism charge." Reed looked at him, his face a mask of grim reality. "That's not what the data says, David. The switch, it's not just moving money. It's programmed to perform a zero-fill wipe of every server log we've recovered, including the ones that might have shown a secondary login." David felt the floor drop away. "What?" "In 24 hours, Reed continued, the only evidence that exists will be the biometrics Michael stole. The logs that show the routing, the latency, the ghost signatures. They'll be gone, deleted by a protocol that carries your digital thumbprint. You didn't just build a bomb, David. You built a bomb that destroys the evidence of who actually planted it." David slumped back in his chair. The trap was perfect. Michael wasn't just killing him. He was erasing the truth, leaving only a lie so well constructed that even the math would agree with it. "We have one shot," David said, his voice low and urgent. They were in a safe house now, a nondescript brownstone in Brooklyn with reinforced shutters and a scent of stale cigarettes and floor cleaner. Sarah was there too, though she sat in the corner, her eyes red-rimmed, her apology log clutched to her chest like a shield. Reed stood by the window, his arms crossed, his mountain-like frame blocking the light. "I'm listening," Reed said. "Michael is an egoist," David explained, his fingers tapping the wooden table. 2, 3, 5. He doesn't just want the money. He wants the master key. He thinks I have a physical drive that can unlock the company's deep reserve accounts he can't reach without my final authorization. And do you? Reed asked. No, David admitted. But he doesn't know that. If we leak word that I'm being moved to a Manhattan safety deposit box to retrieve the key for the FBI, he'll come for it. He can't help himself. He'll have to intercept the transfer, and to do that, he'll have to use his own high-level access codes to track us in real time. You want to use yourself as bait? Sarah whispered from the corner. Sorry, but that's suicide. It's the only way to get his digital signature on a live network, David said, looking at Reed. If he tries to backhack the transport's GPS or the bank's security, we can trap his signal. We can prove he's the one pulling the strings. Reed was silent for a long time. He looked at the ceiling, then at David. If this fails, Miller, I can't protect you. The director is already calling for your head. It won't fail, David said, though his heart was a frantic bird against his ribs. The logic is sound. The next morning, the air was crisp and smelled of impending snow. They moved in a 3-car convoy, the black SUVs weaving through the morning traffic toward Lower Manhattan. David sat in the middle vehicle, flanked by Reed and 2 other agents. Thomas Scott, the young tech analyst, sat in the front seat, his lap covered in a dozen labeled sugar packets he used to steady his nerves. They were 3 blocks from the bank when the world exploded. A heavy delivery truck swerved out of a side street, slamming into the lead SUV with the force of a falling moon. The sound was a deafening crunch of steel and shattering glass. Before David could even scream, a hail of gunfire erupted from the rooftops. "Get down!" Reed roared, shoving David onto the floorboards. The windows of the SUV disintegrated, spraying David with diamonds of safety glass. The sound of the bullets hitting the armored plating was like 1,000 hammers pounding on a drum. Clang, 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 clang. The SUV lurched as the driver tried to reverse, but a second vehicle blocked them from behind. They were trapped in a kill zone. "Reed's hit," Thomas screamed. David looked up. Reed was slumped against the door, his hand clutched to his shoulder. Blood, dark and thick, was soaking through his tactical vest, smelling of copper and salt. "I'm fine," Reed wheezed, his face turning the color of ash. "Thomas, get the link up. We need the signal." But Thomas was frozen, his hands shaking so hard he knocked his stash of sugar packets onto the floor. The young analyst was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with a primal terror. David didn't think. He couldn't afford to. He scrambled over the seat, his hands slick with Reed's blood. He grabbed the field laptop from Thomas's lap. "Stay down," David commanded. He ignored the bullets whistling through the cabin. He focused on the screen. The connection was flickering. He could see a massive surge in the local network. Someone was trying to bypass the convoy's internal comms. "I see him," David whispered. "He's trying to shut down our engine controllers." He felt a sharp pain in his leg, a piece of shrapnel, but he pushed it aside. He began to type, his fingers moving in a blur of motion. He wasn't just defending, he was building a bridge. "Come on, Michael," he hissed. "Take the bait." Subverted. On the screen, a green light flickered. Connection established. David felt a surge of triumph. "I've got him, Reed. I've got his signature. He's routing through a server in Jersey City. I'm tagging the packets now. It's a direct link to his personal device." Reed looked up, a glimmer of hope in his pained eyes. "Do it, Miller. Lock him down." David hammered the enter key, sending the trap code through the open connection. He watched the progress bar. 90, 95, 100%. Success. The screen flashed a confirmation. Sender identified. Michael Davis. Location encrypted. David slumped back, a ragged breath escaping his lungs. He had done it. He had caught the ghost. He looked at Sarah, who was huddled in the back, and gave a small, bloody nod. "We got him." But then the screen flickered. The green light turned a violent, pulsing red. Phase 3. The crack. The laptop began to whine, a high-pitched mechanical shriek that made David's teeth ache. The lines of code on the screen began to scramble, reversing themselves. What is this?" Thomas stammered, finally finding his voice. "The data. It's flowing the wrong way." David's heart stopped. He realized, with a soul-crushing horror, what he had done. Michael hadn't just taken the bait. He had been waiting for David to open the door. Phase 4. Catastrophic reveal. "He's not being tracked," David whispered, his voice trembling. "He's using the connection I just built to bypass the FBI's primary firewall. I didn't trap him. I gave him the keys to the kingdom." On the screen, a new window popped up. It was a live feed of the FBI's central mainframe. David watched as Michael's code, the dead man's switch, was injected directly into the heart of the federal system. The switch didn't just delete David's logs. It began to purge the entire investigative database. "No," Reed groaned, trying to reach for the laptop. "Miller, stop it." "I can't," David cried, his fingers frantic. "He's locked me out. He's using my own bypass protocol to authorize the deletion." A message flashed on the screen, a final taunt from Michael. "Thanks for the upgrade, David. ROI infinite." In a matter of seconds, 3 years of federal investigations were erased. The evidence against Michael, the logs of the illegal transfers, the records of the dead man's switch, all of it vanished into a vacuum of zeros and ones. And because the connection had originated from David's laptop, the system recorded it as an authorized purge by the primary suspect. The gunfire outside stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The mercenaries didn't need to kill them anymore. The job was done. The door of the SUV was ripped open. It wasn't Michael's men. It was a tactical team in black gear, led by Jennifer Martinez, the director of the FBI. Her face was a mask of cold fury, her humming of "Nearer, my God, to thee," a low, terrifying drone in the smoke-filled air. "Agent Reed, step away from the prisoner," Martinez commanded. "Director, wait," Reed wheezed. It was a trap. Michael Davis just contacted our office." Martinez interrupted, her voice like ice. "He provided proof that Mr. Miller just used a federal terminal to destroy evidence and transfer another $50 million to a North Korean fund. He claims he's been acting as a confidential informant to help us catch Miller in the act." David looked at the screen. His bank accounts, everything he had left, were empty. The money had been moved in his name, using the very connection he had just established. "He won," David said, his voice a hollow shell. "Take him," Martinez ordered. "Maximum security. No visitors, no computers. He's going to a place where he'll never see a screen again." As they dragged David from the wreckage, he saw Sarah standing on the sidewalk. She wasn't crying anymore. She was just staring at him, her apology log, lying forgotten in the gutter, soaking up the oily rainwater. He had tried to be smart. He had tried to use logic to fix a broken world. And in doing so, he had become the very monster they accused him of being. The transport van was a steel coffin on wheels. David sat in the back, his hands and feet shackled, the rhythmic thrum-thrum of the tires against the pavement, the only sound in the darkness. He was at rock bottom. His company was gone. His reputation was a charred ruin. His parents' home had been seized as collateral for the stolen funds. He had nothing. But in the darkness, David's fingers began to move. 2, 3, 5, 7. He felt the silver bypass key in his sleeve. Reed hadn't taken it. In the chaos of the shooting, the agent had slipped the evidence bag back into David's pocket. A final, silent act of trust from a man who had seen the truth in the line of fire. David knew he only had minutes before they reached the facility. He leaned his head against the cold metal wall, closing his eyes. He didn't need a screen. He had the architecture of the system memorized. He realized the flaw in Michael's victory. To perform a backhack of that magnitude, to bypass a Tier 4 federal firewall in real time, Michael had to maintain a persistent biometric handshake. He had to be physically present at his terminal, his eyes on the scanner, his voice authorizing every packet. Michael had been so focused on winning that he had forgotten the most basic rule of the bridge. It works both ways. David reached into his sleeve and pulled out the bypass key. He didn't have a laptop, but the transport van had a maintenance port under the seat. A simple interface for the vehicle's GPS and diagnostic systems. He slid the key into the port. The device hummed, a tiny vibration against his thigh. He didn't try to stop the transfer. He didn't try to recover the money. Instead, he injected a mirror script. A piece of code he'd written as a teenager, designed to reflect a hacker's own signal back at them. "Authorize this, Michael," David whispered. The script forced Michael's local terminal to perform a handshake to finalize the North Korean transfer. But instead of just accepting the biometric data, David's script triggered the terminal's own security camera and microphone. For 3 seconds, the FBI's central mainframe didn't just receive a digital signature. It received a high-definition, live-streamed video of Michael Davis sitting in a hotel suite in Dubai. His face clear, his voice caught in a moment of arrogant laughter as he spoke to someone off-camera. "It's done." Michael's voice echoed through the van's speakers, clear as a bell. "The judge is in place. Miller is buried. We can move the rest of the assets by morning." David's heart hammered. The judge. He reversed the stream, pushing the video feed not just to the FBI, but to every major news outlet in the city. He used the last of the bypass key's power to unlock the encrypted logs Michael thought he had destroyed. They weren't gone. They were just hidden in the shadow partition of the federal server, a place only a master of the architecture could find. The van screeched to a halt. The doors swung open, revealing Agent Reed and a dozen tactical officers. But they weren't reaching for David. They were looking at their phones. The video of Michael was everywhere. It was on the jumbotrons in Times Square. It was on every news feed in the country. And the man Michael was talking to in the video, the partner he was celebrating with, was clearly visible in the reflection of a mirror. It was Judge Robert Wilson. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of a distant siren. A week later, the sun was shining over New York. A rare, warm day that smelled of salt and honey. David stood on the steps of the courthouse, his hands free of shackles, his silk shirt clean, but his pockets empty. The charges had been vacated. The master key had been revealed as a ruse, and the live biometric evidence had been enough to dismantle the entire conspiracy. Michael had been arrested by Interpol in Dubai, caught with the very hardware he'd used to frame David. Judge Wilson was in federal custody, his perfect life revealed as a facade of corruption. Sarah Johnson walked down the steps toward him. She looked different. Her hair was brushed, her eyes clear. She wasn't carrying her apology log. "I'm sorry," she said, then stopped herself. She laughed, a genuine light sound. "No, I'm not sorry. I'm just glad." David looked at her. For the first time in his life, he didn't scan her for data. He didn't try to correct her sentence. He just saw a person. "I lost everything, Sarah," David said, looking out at the city. "The mansion, the company, the millions. I'm penniless." Sarah stepped beside him, looking toward the horizon. "You're not penniless, David. You have your name back. And for the first time, you're not hiding behind a screen." David reached into his pocket and felt the silver bypass key. It was dead now, its circuits fried by the final script. He looked at the small, cold piece of metal, the thing he had once thought was more important than human loyalty. He walked to a nearby trash bin and dropped it in. The metal hit the plastic with a dull, final thud. David Miller turned away from the courthouse and began to walk. He didn't have a car, and he didn't have a plan. But as he merged into the crowd on the busy New York street, his fingers weren't tapping, his hands were steady, his heart was quiet, and for the first time in 32 years, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He was free.